This is the Constitutional Era Objective 3, Part 2, about how the Washington administration established the American economy, a task which fell to this man, George Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hamilton was not going to have an easy time of this. The first thing he had to do was deal with the post-war debt that the United States had built up during the American Revolution, a debt that for the most part had not been paid off. And once he did that, he was supposed to stabilize the American economy to the point where it could just grow and get stronger as time passed on. Now, he did manage to pull this off. In many circles, he's considered to be the father of the American economy. But what bothered people some about Alexander Hamilton was the do-it-at-all-costs mentality that he took, even if it meant damaging his own personal reputation. In fact, Hamilton's 3 policies that he used to save the national economy were controversial enough that it probably cost him a chance to run for president himself later on. The first thing Hamilton did was to have policies to favor the wealthy so that they, in turn, would provide support to the new government. If the upper class had more money in their pockets, they would spend on goods and services, or spend to start their own business, or spend to invest in someone else's business. No matter what they did with their money, it would increase demand across the country, and in order to meet that increased demand, you would have to greatly increase supply. And the only way to increase supply was to hire the common man for jobs that would put money in their pockets and allow them to spend and keep the cycle going. It was the concept of trickle-down economics, that the wealth of the upper class would trickle down to the common man. But before Hamilton could strengthen the American economy through the use of quote-unquote trickle-down economics, he was going to have to figure out a way to pay off the debt that was left over from the American Revolution, debt that in some cases had been sitting there for going on 10 years. Now remember, in the Articles of Confederation, each state was virtually responsible for itself, and that included the idea that each state would pay off its own war debts. The national level of government back then had no way to help out. They couldn't collect any revenue in any way because they couldn't tax. They had to rely on states just voluntarily giving them money just to operate. But the new Constitution-based government had given the federal level more power, and Alexander Hamilton decided to use that power to try to pay off the national debt through a policy called funding at par, also known as Congressional assumption of war debt. Now, the idea behind assumption was pretty simple. The federal government, through Congress, would go to each state, and they would take their war debt away from them, then pay off the war debt of each state with interest to whomever the money was owed. Now, if you were a state like Massachusetts, which had a lot of war debt at that time, you loved this idea. This new federal level of government was swooping in and taking that cloud of debt from over your head, relieving a big burden on you. I mean, we all know how it feels when you get a debt paid off. But they just took it away from them and said, no, no strings attached. We'll just take care of it for you. You can just wash your hands of the whole thing. Now, other states were not so in favor of the policy, mostly because they were suspicious. Virginia, for example, had been the home to George Washington, who was a Federalist. But it had also been the home to Thomas Jefferson, an anti-Federalist. And it's a very rural state even still today, so there were lots of farmers and people that would fall into the common man category. Most of those people were anti-Federalists as well. They were against the idea of a strong federal government doing any kind of power play to take their rights away or impose their will on them. Plus, Virginia had already paid off its war debt. So when they looked at this policy of Hamilton's, they saw a Federalist who was trying to involve them in something that they were going to regret later. They suspected, and they were kind of right, that Hamilton was going to just say, listen, I paid off all your war debts, now you guys do what I tell you to do. Well, Virginia was having none of it until Hamilton came along and said, I'll tell you what, we're going to be finding a place for a brand new federal capital, and when we do, what would you say if I decided to put it right here, right next to you guys, so you could have easy access to it, as well as every other southern state could have easy access to it whenever you wanted to? Well, now Virginia was a little more willing to listen. As a result, George Washington himself traveled to the state of Maryland to survey a large marshland known as Foggy Bottom, located in this general area right here along the banks of the Potomac River. Today, Foggy Bottom is known as Washington, D.C. Now, this is an era of compromise after all, and Virginia somewhat got what they wanted, the national capital located right next to them. And Hamilton, in exchange for putting Washington, D.C. where he did, definitely got what he wanted, which was Virginia's support as well as the support of other states to go ahead with his plan to take on the war debt of every state. But now what? How was he going to pay it off? Well, the answer was in taxes, both on foreign nations and on the United States itself. He issued a series of tariffs, and if you don't remember what that means, if England, let's say, wants to sell products here, they've got to pay the United States to do it. Hamilton managed to get a lot of money that way, and when he combined that with the revenue he was getting from new taxes that he put on the United States, the war debt was paid off fairly soon. Nonetheless, the anti-federalists of the country, led by Thomas Jefferson, were growing more and more suspicious of Alexander Hamilton, his policies, and how he went about getting things done. Remember that Hamilton was a Federalist, which meant a couple of things. First of all, he was in the upper class, as many Federalists were. The anti-Federalists, made up mostly of the common man, didn't like that. Secondly, Hamilton had been at the Constitutional Convention, by definition as a Federalist who wanted to draw up a document that gave the federal level of government more power than they had under the Articles of Confederation. The anti-federalists liked that state governments and local governments had more say in things. They did not want the Constitution adopted. Third, Hamilton seemed to have no problem in his role of Secretary of the Treasury in instituting that newfound federal power to get involved in the lives of the common man and the states through his policies of favoring the wealthy and assuming the war debt of the states. These were all things that the anti-federalists felt were going to turn on them at some point and have the federal government taking more and more rights and power away from them. Well, nothing upset them more than the third part of Hamilton's plan to save the national economy, that being Hamilton's desire to create a Bank of the United States, a national federal bank. Now, it seemed innocent enough. The purposes of the Bank of the United States were twofold. First of all, it was meant to hold the surplus funds that the government had collected through taxes and tariffs. The government could just basically have a bank account and eventually decide that they would want to spend it on something, invest it on something, or just hold on to it for future causes. The second purpose of the Bank of the United States was to just print paper money. But that's not what upset the anti-federalists the most. What upset them was whether or not it was even constitutional to have a Bank of the United States. Thomas Jefferson correctly argued that the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution said if it's not written in the Constitution, it's up to states to decide. There was nothing in the Constitution written about a Bank of the United States. Therefore, according to the 10th Amendment, states were the only ones that had the right to create banks. This seemed again like a power play by the federal government. And given that Jefferson was Secretary of State, it probably made the cabinet meetings a little bit awkward. Now, Hamilton's biggest problem wasn't a little bit of tension at the cabinet meetings. His biggest problem was that Jefferson was probably right. Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution is where you can find everything you need to know about Congress. And Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution is where you can find the enumerated powers of Congress. The word enumerated meaning listed in numerical order, 1 through 18 in this particular case. Now, in Section 8, the first 17 powers that are listed there are considered to be the expressed powers of Congress. These are the powers that the U.S. Constitution basically comes right out and says that Congress can do. But among those powers, you will not find the creation of a Bank of the United States. Jefferson, therefore, went to the courts and wanted a very strict interpretation of the Constitution, saying that if the creation of a Bank of the United States is not listed in the expressed powers of Congress, then according to the 10th Amendment, states have the right to decide that for themselves and create their own banks. Now, Hamilton wanted this to happen pretty badly, so he wanted a much more loose interpretation of the Constitution. And how do you make that happen? Well, that brings us to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause. The Necessary and Proper Clause deals with the implied powers of Congress, the powers that aren't necessarily stated in the Constitution, but it's just generally implied that Congress should be able to do in order to carry out their expressed powers. For example, among the expressed powers, you'll find the power for Congress to lay and collect taxes, the power to regulate interstate commerce, and to establish navies and armies and post offices. But you won't find there anything that says that tax money can be used to actually build a post office, or provide for the heat or the electricity or the uniforms or the pay or even the transportation for the mail carriers to deliver the mail. But isn't it just implied that you should be able to do that? Isn't it necessary for the U.S. Congress to use tax money for that? Isn't that a proper use of taxpayer money? Well, this is the Necessary and Proper Clause, and this is what Hamilton tried to use to get his Bank of the United States. He took a look at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, the right of the U.S. Congress to regulate interstate commerce, and some would say that gives them the right to regulate the economy. Hamilton said it's necessary and proper to have a Bank of the United States to carry out Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. It was a very loose connection. But in the end, Alexander Hamilton got what he wanted again. He had somehow convinced the courts that the creation of a Bank of the United States was necessary and proper for Congress to carry out its expressed power of regulating interstate commerce. Hamilton had stretched the Necessary and Proper Clause about as far as it would go, and in doing so set a very bad precedent that would haunt us for generations to come. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 of the U.S. Constitution became mockingly known as the Elastic Clause, as politicians for generations would stretch it as far as they could to get what they wanted, when they wanted, any way they possibly could. But there were other notable domestic policies and events of the Washington presidency. The Judiciary Act of 1789 created the U.S. Supreme Court and many federal courts underneath it. The first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court was John Jay, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. There was also, of course, the Bill of Rights and the Bank of the United States in 1791, and there was another domestic event during the Washington presidency that was far more historically significant than most people give it credit for. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, which took place in southwestern Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. Now, it's important to understand one thing. Alcohol production has been a huge part of American culture since the 1700s. In fact, George Washington at one time was the single biggest distiller of alcohol in his home state of Virginia. Throughout American history, people have gone to the hills with makeshift stills to produce homemade alcohol. And that's a trend that has continued even into the modern day. For over 200 years, alcohol production in the United States has been big business, particularly in the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern United States. And it just makes sense that the northwestern part of the Appalachian Mountains, also known as southwestern Pennsylvania, is where a whiskey rebellion would take place if there was ever going to be one. See, a lot of the people who were producing alcohol illegally did not want to pay Alexander Hamilton's whiskey tax. In fact, anytime a tax collector would come by, they would often find themselves tarred and feathered and sent away with no tax revenue. In response, Washington sends in the militia to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion, and that's what makes it historically significant as another legacy he leaves behind. This was the first time the new federal government had to deal with a potential mobocracy situation, and they emphatically stepped in and said, "We are willing to use force against our own people to maintain order if need be. Mobs will not rule this country anymore." And the farmers soon paid the taxes. Now that, of course, meant across the country, and even in modern-day Pittsburgh, that the U.S. government was going to be respected, if not always appreciated. Thanks again for listening.